Hello my dear friends, how are you? I'm Mario Theriger and today I'm going to talk about the runic inscription Alu, which often appears in artifacts of Germanic Iron Age migration period, making an appearance in several brachiates which are ornaments or plates of beaten metal, typically a thin gold disc resembling medals or medal-shaped jewelry serving as talismans, which were influenced by Romanization. In fact, we are talking about Roman Iron Age in Germanic context, and I'll put a note down here, don't worry. But the inscription Alu also appears in other contexts, not just pieces of jewelry, which we shall see further ahead as well. In fact, the formula Alu and also Laukaz seem to have been the favorite protective words of the Roman Iron Age period in continental Germanic context and Northern Europe. I have in fact talked about this before on the video I've made concerning that phrase Ariua, Lauthu, Laukar, Gakar, Alu, Ole, Lule, Laukar, right? But today I would like to focus solely on the Alu formula. Although I take the opportunity to say that the formula Laukar, the final letter, which is R, represents the rune Alis, which was pronounced as Z during the Germanic Iron Age period, and then gradually became pronounced as R during the language transition of late Iron Age into the period of Scandinavia, often referred to as Viking Age, with the language shift into Old Norse, somewhere around the late migration period. There are no certainties, but the sound change most likely occurred around the 5th century. The symbol you see right here somewhere, the symbol R as the rune Alis during the Roman Iron Age of Germanic context means therefore that it should be pronounced as Z, so the formula would actually sound as Laukaz, right? But pronounced as R, Laukar, if instead we want to pronounce it as it was pronounced during the Viking Age for the same rune, Alis, usually appearing in the inverted position by the 8th century to represent the R sound, right? Which is the Ir rune symbol. Whose sound isn't the typical R sounds we usually make by the use of the tongue, but instead the R sound with the throat, guttural R. Mostly found in languages such as Portuguese, French, German, Dutch, and Old Norse, to name a few. So since we are dealing with a formula from the Iron Age, I think it would be more accurate to pronounce Laukaz as Laukaz, right? Laukaz. This was just a side note. Returning to the formula Alu, I'm not going to address this subject by trying to find some esoteric meaning behind this formula. There's plenty of esoteric works that dismiss a lot of evidences, and I don't think that is the right approach to take. This video is purely academic, bibliography by the end of this video, so you can check for yourselves. And I think we should indeed start with what is truly historically and archaeologically known, instead of starting from the esoteric and occultic point of view, which will end up leading us further away from the actual purposes and meanings behind this formula, the formula Alu. The path may be crooked, but let's not twist it more than it is necessary. If we are going to try to formulate an esoteric and magical meaning for this formula, best start with what is truly known, and from there develop other meanings and possible interpretations. And not the other way around, right? So that's that. With no more delay, let's start our today's video, my dear friends. Please. Alright, so here we go. The formula Alu was mostly used to address someone when seeing people on the streets. Instead of good morning, it was Alu. Hey Sven! Alu! I'm just messing with you, obviously. Right, Alu literally means ale. But this formula, especially in brachiates, but also its occurrence in other texts and objects, has often been quite enigmatic. So it is usually translated as magic, simply magic. Because it is seemingly odd that people would go through all the trouble to beat metal in its raw state or carve on stone the word ale, the drink, right? So it is often thought that even though the literal meaning is ale, in runic text, it must have been some kind of magic formula. Therefore, its meaning has often been proposed as magic, simply and just magic. So we have a series of findings, just as the ones I have presented on that other video, where the Alu formula is taken as meaning magic. Let me give you an example. The Daurum Bracteate 5, which reads as New Yili Alu, interpreted as new magic, or the Bracteate IK1491 that reads Laukaz Alu. Gakar is interpreted as Gauka, the cuckoo bird, therefore interpreted as cuckoo magic, probably in reference to bird song, which is often related to Galdr, later on in written sources of medieval Scandinavia as a form of magic song. The Verluse fibula that reads Alugud, which is interpreted as a name, a feminine name, I believe, meaning good magic. Or the Elgasam stone with the formula, again, Alu, interpreted as meaning magic, just magic. I think you get the point that it has often been interpreted as meaning magic. Because why else would Iron Age Germanic people, during the migration period, write so much the word ale? Were they drunk all the time? Was ale so important in their daily lives and economy? The answer is yes, to the latter, not that they were drunk all the time, obviously. This has often been dismissed, however. The word means ale, an alcoholic beverage. But it was thought that the combination of these three runes meant something else, some sort of magic formula that must mean magic, or a magical intention or incantation even. Or the three runes have a meaning of their own separately, and together they form a magical expression. So it has often been interpreted as that when appearing in relation to other words, it is the magic of the things the other words express. Or when appearing alone, it's just to write magic. But this isn't the case. The intention is clear. It was indeed to write ale, but this doesn't mean that it is less magical. In fact, it isn't wrong to say that Alu means magic, although not in the literal sense, but the intention implied is a sort of magic, more on the level of consecration of something, turning something sacred with a religious purpose. But indeed, the intention seems to have been literally to write ale. And this has often been dismissed because ale, beer, it was an important product for Iron Age Germanic peoples, not just in the economy, but the very transformation of primary elements into a drinkable consumable made ale, beer, an important component. I would even say essential, as a magical substance through which consecration is administered, making something hallowed, or magical, and or consecrated. Ale as the product to consecrate something, to make, turn, or declare something as sacred. This has often been dismissed for about 70 years or so since the first runic inscriptions were found, and when it comes to the study of runic formulas such as this one, especially the Alu formula, which has been interpreted as meaning magic, but there's something much more historically, religiously, and overall culturally deeper in this formula that helps us to understand part of the religious mentality of these peoples. Because, let's face it, nowadays we just go into a bar or a pub and ask for ale or beer, and that's it. Oi, give me beer. Thaun elo. So ale has become a very common product. But to Iron Age peoples, it was very important, even on a religious sphere, especially on a religious sphere. I'm not going to develop on this video today on the importance of ale and or beer in the Iron Age Germanic societies and in medieval Scandinavia. I'll probably make a video solely focusing on that, on this subject on another time. However, it is important to spare a few words to better understand, or at least try to grasp this formula and why it was one of the most common and special runic expressions to be used during this period, and indeed the favorite protective words, as it were, of the Roman Iron Age. Let's take into consideration that for these peoples, especially in a pre-Christian context and the rather animistic pagan mentality, there was no concrete separation between the secular and the sacred. I've talked about this before many times, that even in the archaeological context of pre-Christian cultures, it's really very difficult to identify the separation between the religious and the magical. Sometimes that separation just doesn't exist at all, because that separation is something of the late medieval Christian mindset, much more reinforced actually in the modern period with Protestantism. But for animists and pagan cultures, there was no need to create separations between the magical and the religious, or between the secular and the religious, or the sacred, or the temporal and the spiritual, if you will, as everyday acts were considered magical acts, especially in an animistic sense, where human actions were already considered a contact and a creation of relationship between the people of the community, or amongst the people of the community, but also with other entities that surround the human world. The very act of eating and drinking was considered magical, made in communion with the gods and the beings that inhabit the world. For example, the creation of beer, brewing beer, is the transformation of the agricultural product, whose fertility would not be possible if there were no symbiotic relationships between humans and the beings that provide fertility of the soils, and the entities that manifest themselves through weather phenomena, like rain, for instance, and even the beings that inhabit the cereals. Hence, the production itself of beer, and beer itself, the final product, is a magical act that is the transformation of a symbiotic relationship into something concrete that can be consumed and thus keep the relationship stronger and more effective. Beer was used in rituals and as a means of access, communication, and the creation of relationships to and with the gods. Ale, it wasn't such a trivial thing. The drink was sacred, and its sacredness was present from the production and choice of ingredients to its manufacture and consumption. Of course, it wasn't just ale which had this sacred aspect. In Scandinavia during the medieval period, post-Viking Age, barley was the basic grain cultivated during this period. But there were other products with equal importance and even sacredness, such as imported wine, but also mead and cider. We are talking about the importance of the symbiotic relationship between human and nature, and all the relationships created annually with entities that provide effectiveness in these relationships in an animist or animistic understanding that was still very present even after the introduction to Christianity, Catholicism. Therefore, in relation to ale, we are dealing with a product of rapid fermentation of cereals and aromatic herbs. The herbs themselves were both for medicinal and magical use, which were consecrated to the gods and thus protecting the drink itself and whoever ingested it. Not to mention that some 13th century Nordic texts cite that intoxication caused by alcohol and herbs, which provides a connection with the gods. Historical records show that beer consumption was particularly important and consumed in various religious seasonal festivals. Remember, for instance, the imposed law of Gulathing, one of the oldest and largest parliamentary assemblies in Norway that took place every year from between the 900 and the 1300s of the Common Era, which required farmers in groups of at least 3 people to brew beer and ale, two distinct products in medieval Scandinavia, which I shall point out further ahead. And by law, they produced beer to be consumed in important sacred festivals. If they failed, their farms and the brewing of beer would be given to the church, the religious organism that would make sure that beer would properly be produced to ensure its consumption during sacred annual festivals. In Nordic mythology, as another example, we have Ahir, the giant of the sea who was highly respected by the gods, all the gods, for his beer production, the brewing of beer, the best ale Odin ever had, according to the sources. Hence, several artifacts with inscriptions Alu appear not only on bracteates, but some monuments, everyday utensils, and even objects, such as ceramic cups and other drinking vessels. We are before the word ale in a sense of protection and magic, but not as a special runic formula whose sequence of 3 runes provides a magical formula, but actually we are before the very word ale, in this case a Germanic word of the Iron Age. We are talking about a period more or less between 200 to 500 of the Common Era. The word for ale, which is alu, in the sense of being the product that provides the consecration of something, the protection of something, or makes something magical and or sacred. So it is very likely that when we have the formula alu, if it is inserted in a sentence, it is most likely the consecration of what is being expressed in writing, in runes. And when it appears alone, we are facing the consecration of the object itself, where the word was engraved. For example, the Helgasam stone with the word alu, in the sense of consecrating this stone. It is no longer a common stone, but now it has a religious and sacred character, marked as a sacred object by the identification of the word alu itself, ale, as the designation of the product through which a consecration through ritual is possible, making this stone a cult stone, or actually marking a place of cult or a gathering place for sacrifice and other religious motifs. Perhaps it would be useful to return to the meaning found in some bracteates concerning Laukaz, and Alu, and perhaps give a new light to the phrase I've tried to deconstruct in that other video, Ariua, Lauthu, Laukar, Gakar, Alu, Ole, Lule, Laukar. As said before, both Laukaz and Alu were by far the most used formulas in the Iron Age. Sometimes these two come together, quite often actually. Such is the case of the Skrustrup bracteate. And I think this is when it gets interesting and perhaps more mysterious. It has often been interpreted that when Laukaz and Alu come together, the translation is Laukaz Magic. So the magic of whatever Laukaz is trying to express. Taking into consideration what was previously said concerning Alu, as a formula to consecrate something, the formula Alu isn't solely consecrating the object in which the formula itself was engraved, transforming the object into a sacred object with a magic purpose, perhaps even an apotropaic purpose. In this case of a bracteate, it is transformed into a talisman. However, sometimes it follows Laukaz, and in any other phrase, it is possible that Alu, the formula Alu, also expresses the consecration of what is written. There's a particular set of words that expresses a thought, and Alu serves as the element that expresses the consecration of what is being told. So I find it curious when the formula Alu comes together with Laukaz. And here's why. Let's take into consideration that Laukaz is the rune Logos, which means water. Laukaz itself means leek. This is not a question of potato, potato, tomato, tomato. I think there's an interesting play of words here. Laukaz has both water and leek. At first glance, may not make much sense. However, as previously stated, the process of fabricating ale, brewing ale as a ritual substance to consecrate something, to hallow something or some place, or used in ritual performances, its fabrication also requires the ingredients to be consecrated. Water, cereals, and herbs that were gathered would pass through a process of consecration to be turned into hallowed substances to make the sacred ale. Some herbs with medicinal purposes, which by themselves would propitiate protection to whoever consumed the sacred ale. So, if we take Laukaz followed by Alu in some engravings, perhaps we are in the presence of the consecration of water to make the ale, the water itself having been consecrated, indicating that the formula Alu means ale, but also means the very act of consecrating, and it is consecrated water, which in turn allows the fabrication of ale as a sacred element. So we are in the presence of a sort of cycle, because you do not create something sacred to be used to consecrate something without having consecrated the elements themselves that will create the substance that allows the blessing, sanctification, consecration to exalt, hallow, and even deify something, right? But we also have Laukaz as leek, which could very well be one of the plant elements to make a type of ale. There's beer made of leeks, which gives an interesting flavor. However, I think leek here enters as a medicinal element that allows the very consecration of the ale itself, but also as the element with medicinal purposes. When the sacred ale is used in ritual, in communal performances, when the sacred ale is to be shared as a consumable among those participating in the ritual. If we take a look at Old Norse sources, written sources, we find an outstanding amount of accounts making references to leeks, not only as an important plant element for medicinal purposes, but also for magic itself. And this is where I want to get, because the leek is also connected to necromancy, but also fertility, creation of life, and a variety of things involving magic and magical formulas. I will give some examples in a moment, don't worry. But take this into consideration that the formula Laukaz Alu may not be solely the consecration of water to turn into ale, but also the consecration of leeks. But leeks themselves being the important element, plant element, in a magical performance that allows the very consecration of water and ale. Let's take a look at stanza 4 of the Voluspot, and I quote: "Before the sons of Bor brought up the land surface, those who shaped glorious Midgard, the sun shone from the south of the stone hole, then the ground was grown over with green leek, or leeks, plural. It's interesting to notice that the very myth of the creation of the world mentions leeks. After the world is shaped, anything could appear as flora. Any element could have been picked up to explain that the earth was now with life, green and fertile. But the author, or authors of the Voluspa, specifically picked leeks. The ground of the earth is green because it's filled with leeks. We understand this to be an important food resource in Northern Europe, indicating prosperity, fertility, probably one of the best plants that could withstand the harsher climates in the north, particularly of Iceland, as the Voluspa, the poem, the source Voluspa, was without a doubt written by an Icelander, or Icelanders. However, it seems to also be referring to the properties of leek as a medicinal but also as a powerful magical component from which life is created and maintained. So it would have been important to include leeks as the plant element that stands out in the first stages of the creation of the world and the first vestiges of life and fertility, given its importance in Iron Age and medieval Nordic societies. But of course, a side note, we should be careful when translating the Old Norse word laukr as leek, because the old Germanic word prior to Old Norse seems to have also referred to onion and garlic as well as leek. So it may be a reference to any of these three plants, and I think that very much depends on the geographic position and climate, as leeks weren't particularly abundant in Scandinavia, but they were in continental Europe. Garlic and onion, on the other hand, seems to have been particularly abundant in the north. So again, this may be a clever play of words referring to the importance of certain plants as medicinals and as a sign of fertility and abundance. In fact, there's a good example, which is the fluxan, bone scraping knife circa mid-5th century, with an engraving that reads as Lina Laukaz, and ends with an F rune. Unfortunately, I couldn't find a proper image to show you, so I'm sorry, but the description of this finding does appear in archaeological reports as well as in several sources concerning early runic inscriptions in Germanic context. The runic inscription Lina Laukaz means linen and leek, which is a formula of fruitfulness. In this case, the rune, the F rune, possibly represents Fehu, the rune of wealth. So leeks were important plants with a strong connotation to fruitfulness. But let's see other examples. I would like to give as another example the source Volsa Thauthre, which I would like to make a video of in the future to properly delve into this account and give you a lot more details. And indeed, I have made a reference to it before, when I did that video to explain that pre-Christian Scandinavian belief systems varied quite a lot from region to region, even from town to town, village to village. And Scandinavians did not believe and even praised the exact same religious conceptions. And the account Volsa Thauthre is a very good account of post-Christian, remaining pagan sort of worship in a particularly remote farm in the north of Norway, if I'm not mistaken, which is very different from the usual religious conceptions of pre-Christian Scandinavia. I'm not going to delve too much on this particularly interesting example, but we should take a couple of details into account. In the text Olav's Saga Helga, within the Fertility book, it is described to us what appears to be the last remnants of an archaic Scandinavian phallic cult, a type of magic that could be considered necromancy, since it is the reanimation of an animal, or to be more precise, the reanimation of a particular piece of anatomy of a horse. So, in Volsa Thalfre, it is described that an elderly woman in the north of Norway, at a particular point in this account, doesn't matter the details for now, she comes with a horse's phallus wrapped in linen cloth. In fact, she goes into the kitchen, dried the horse's phallus, wrapped it in a linen cloth, pay close attention at that, and covered it in herbs. And the only herbs we are told of are precisely leeks. The process here is to prevent the horse's phallus from rotting. Through prayers and incantations, this woman used the horse's phallus as some kind of a charm. The thing is alive. It can stand on its own and grow whenever the woman expresses magic words unto it. And she forces the members of the household, to contribute to the livelihood of this particular object of devotion by seating the members of the household in the parlor of the home and passing it around, each person reciting a verse over it. This object bears an animistic understanding, and we may be in the presence of a phallus that has a life of its own through the magic performance of the elderly woman. And it now serves as the physical embodiment of a fertility entity. No need to go into details for now. The purpose of this horse's phallus is never made clear in the poem itself, but it is mentioned that the elderly woman worships it as her god and venerates it daily through incantations and handling by the family, reciting poetic verses over the member as it is passed around in a circle. The important thing to take into consideration in here is that this horse's phallus, through the addition of leeks, ceased to be a horse's phallus to become a fertility talfre, a talisman or charm, in this case with a life of its own. Leeks here not only consecrated the horse's phallus, but also gave it life and purpose, gave it a magical purpose. I didn't refer to the previous example of a runic formula in a scraping knife for no reason. The horse's phallus was wrapped in linen and soaked in a soup of leeks, transforming the phallus into a sacred object of fertility, just the same way the formula we have seen previously, lina, Laukaz, linen and leek, followed by the fertility rune, demonstrates a formula of fruitfulness, and also the implicit idea of fertility and life implicit in the stanza 4 of Vodospa we have also seen previously. The word leek frequently appears in runic formulas of Roman Iron Age in Germanic context, as well as in magical charms in Old Norse literature later on. But as said before, these sources could equally be referring to wild onions and wild garlic. These three plants aren't so different if we take into consideration they are allium vegetables, which have distinctive flavor and aroma. Onions and garlic belong to the allium genus. Shallots, leeks, and chives are also members of the allium vegetable family. So perhaps it's not a specific vegetable, leeks themselves, but it's the natural elements of a family of vegetables. Again, Laukaz in Old Germanic and Laukar in Old Norse, a play of words for allium vegetables. Another example, the Eddic poem Sigurdrifurmal, or the Lay of Sigurdrifa. The drink of the hero must contain leeks in order to protect the drink itself from being enchanted, leeks cast into the liquid. It is interesting to notice that in this account, an awakened Valkyrie shares a lot of information concerning runic lore to the hero Sigurdur, and she does speak of ale runes, ölrunar, carved on a drinking container mixed with leeks. So this gives us the impression of the runic formula Laukaz Alu, leeks and ale. These ale runes could very well be the very inscription of the old Germanic word for ale, which is the formula Alu, which remained even after the language shift into Old Norse in the north. Again, there's archaeological references to the formula Alu engraved in drinking vessels. Again, ale was used in ritual toasting, but also when a person had died and his heirs had come to drink erfjor, grave beer, to mark a new passage, the end of a period and the beginning of the new period for the line of the deceased person, which may indicate that the formula Alu was also connected to the cult of the dead, as well as fertility, as both death and fertility are always present in Old Norse sources, coming together. Be that the death the dead that upon death become elves and help in the fertility of the soils, the goddess Freya, who is the goddess of death and fertility. The previous example we have seen in Volsa Thaltr of the death and reanimation of a piece of anatomy of a horse that will serve as a fertility charm. The very myth of creation, of the death of Ymir, from which life is created, and the world is covered by leeks as a symbolism of fertility, etc. The association with a pre-Christian concept referring to death or the after death and fertility is fairly strong. And here we get close to the function of the formula Alu, especially when it appears together with Laukaz, both together forming a magical formula of the consecration of ale through allium vegetables with medicinal purposes. And at the same time, we understand why some ceramic drinking cups and other drinking vessels had the formula Alu engraved on them to hallow the drink itself, to protect it, combined with allium vegetables, possibly leeks, to enhance its potency and as both medicinal but also for fertility and protective purposes, and perhaps even a ritual drink in important religious festivities. Or allium vegetables such as leeks to prevent the drink from rotting, as that is also the purpose of leeks in the account Volsa Thaltr, and in the account I'm about to express right now, as I have remembered just now, and it has already probably crossed your mind. Take into consideration that the poem of the creation of the world demonstrates that leeks and not grass were the first to emerge, giving a sense of vitality and fertility of leeks. Leeks here seem to also denote the power of revival, as we also see in the necromantic act within the source Volsa Thaltr, soaking or smearing leeks on a dead piece of an animal's anatomy or a horse's phallus in this case, which made it come to life, literally come to life. This isn't the only necromantic account of a piece of anatomy coming to life with the use of leeks. There's the source of Thorleifr Thordarsson's story, in which there's the consultation of a severed head for the purpose of augury and acquiring occult wisdom, which bears striking similarities to the rite expressed in the myth of Odin and the severed head of Mimir. The god Odin revived the severed head of Mimir by smearing it with herbs and chanting over it, just the same way the elderly woman smeared herbs and chanted incantations over the horse's phallus, thus giving it life. Of course, in the case of the elderly woman, we know leeks were involved. However, The Völuspá poem only tells us that Odin speaks with Mimir's head, but doesn't give any details. But in Snorre Sturluson's Heimskringla, we are told that Odin took Mimir's head, smeared it with herbs so that it should not rot, and sang incantations over it, smearing with with to prevent from rotting, just the same way the elderly woman wrapped the phallus in linen and smeared it with herbs to prevent rotting. And as in such a rite a phallus came to life, so did Mimir's head, which granted power to Odin, and it spoke to him and revealed many hidden secrets. The herbs used could have been leeks, indeed, or at the very least vegetables of the Allium family. And again, we have Mimir's well. So supposedly there's also water involved. And this well is an allusion to the act of consecrated water with leeks to reanimate something. I'm not going to talk about the case of linen in this video, but I'll put a note here, down here. I hope I won't forget, because linen seems to be intimately tied with feminine magic, herbs, and witchcraft in one's house, in one's home. So, the important thing to take into consideration now is that the word Laukaz and its Old Norse equivalent Laukar, meaning leek, is inscribed on several bracteates, the little medallions worn as ornaments, which may denote the leek's symbolism of virility, fertility, life, and protection. A magical formula that indicated the purpose of the talisman. And when followed by the formula Alu, Laukaz Alu, it consecrates the object. It gives it an additional power to propitiate the intention described. So it isn't strange that both Laukaz and Alu were the most used formulas. It is to hallow life, to consecrate life, death and reanimation for the purpose of giving fertility. The formula Alu alone is to hallow, is to consecrate, even to deify and turn something or some place or even person and festivity into something sacred. The consecration of ale, and ale being the very element of sacredness. When Alu comes together with Laukaz, it may be the consecration of life, to turn sacred the powers of fertility and protection and revival, turning Iron Age medallions into talismans of fertility and protection and virility, consecrated by the formula Alu itself, turning them into talismans or charms, and not mere jewelry. So if leeks or any allium vegetable was to revive, to give life, the word Laukaz in bracteates gives life to the objects themselves. They are imbued with life, which is why they are worn as talismans in the first place. Because as far as talismans go, especially in an animistic sense, as I have presented on a video precisely dealing with this subject, talismans are imbued with life in order to work. They are imbued with life to be transformed and obtain personhood. So we are in the presence, once again, of an animistic mentality. And the livelihood and personhood of these talismans, of these objects, which, by the formula Alu, are consecrated, and thus they will serve the purpose for which they have been created and brought to life. This isn't a question if you in this era if you believe in this or not. We are talking about an animistic perception of a pagan past and the idea that objects can be imbued with life and have personhood. Thus, they are alive. They are imbued with spirit and have a personality, just like the life, personhood, and personality of Viking Age swords. I have talked about on the video about talismans in Old Norse witchcraft. This animistic belief is still very much alive in several cultures to this day. and the necessity to give personhood to certain objects in order for them to express the purpose for which they have been created. In this way, the Alu formula becomes very important, because it is the very formula that consecrates an object, turning it into something sacred, giving to it a religious, magical, and maybe even a divine purpose. Because let's not forget that many of these bracteates also present mythological motifs and representations of deities, actually revealing a story that illustrates the purpose of each bracteate. To finalize this video, I think it will be useful to add a few other points concerning ale, which is literally the meaning of alu. As said before, the formula alu, even though literally meaning ale, has been interpreted as magic, but also as ecstasy and even intoxicating drink. Since we are talking about an alcoholic beverage that alters human psychological behavior or the human psyche through the fermentation of grain, and since this runic formula seems to be inserted in patterns that gives us an idea of magic, but also a certain level of religiosity, it has probably come to mind the myth of the mead of poetry, the mead of skulls of poets, as the intoxicating drink that gives great wisdom as a sort of holy grail of pre-Christian Scandinavian belief systems. It should be noted that mead, beer, and ale were considered different products, even different substances in Northern Europe, still far into the Middle Ages. Again, as I said before, I'm not going to elaborate on this video the importance of beer and ale in Scandinavia in the Iron Age and the Middle Ages. However, it should be noted that the consumption of beer, ale, in pre-Viking and in pre-Christian Scandinavia wasn't that common as we are led to believe in contemporary depictions of the Old Norse pagans. We know from written records and archaeological sources as well that beer and mead were commonly drunk throughout Europe during the early medieval period and into the Viking Age. In fact, mead is one of the oldest alcoholic beverages, which was already being produced in Mesopotamia among the earliest farming communities. The most ancient Germanic alcoholic drink was probably mead, Old Norse mjöd, Old English mead. Mead was the idealized beverage of the old heroic poetry, as it is said to be the drink for the great and grand occasions, and to be used and or consumed in the temple, in the ceremonial performances, most likely as a sacrificial offering. Ale, however, was for the masses and to be drank at all times. But in the case of Scandinavia, things are a little bit different. Speaking of beer, domesticated grains didn't begin to arrive in Scandinavia until the 7th century of the Common Era, by the end of the Scandinavian Iron Age. There is documented evidence, though, of mead being drank by early Iron Age Scandinavians, which means, most likely, mead preceded beer in the Viking culture. Therefore, archaeologically speaking, there aren't extensive evidences for the production of beer in Scandinavia during the Viking period and periods prior to the Viking period, which is what we are dealing with here in terms of the bracteates, right? As soon as grain was cultivated by Viking Age Scandinavians in late Viking Age, beer was certainly highly consumed due to being a new product in the culture of late Viking Age Scandinavians. By the 8th century, Nordic people in the Viking Age were drinking beer in great abundance. In terms of beer or ale, clearly it must have been quite the phenomenon during the Viking Age, because it was something rather new. And when something new is introduced in a society, it often leads to excessive behavior in the usage of the new product. Which means during the Roman Iron Age period in Northern Europe, ale would have been even more precious, a costly product, a product that was imported from foreign regions, making it even more special by this period, as it wasn't a common product among old Germans, old Saxons, and pre-Viking Age Scandinavians. Which may explain why the word for ale, alu, was the most used runic formula in magical and religious contexts, because of its rarity, which wouldn't have been accessible to all social classes, making it a costly product, augmenting its importance and value. It is very important to note that to us nowadays, the word in English, the word beer and ale don't have a lot of differences in English. But these two drinks were regarded differently in Northern Europe. The term ale comes from the Old English ilo and Old Norse öl, and it was a beverage produced from malted grain. The term beer comes from Old English beor and Old Norse björ, which were thought to be names derived from the word barley. Therefore, when in the sources we find beor and björ, it was thought to be referring to beer because of barley, but were in fact terms used for sweet alcoholic beverages. Björ and beer are terms almost certainly referring to cider, either from apples or pears. Hence the belief that children drank beer as it is indicated by the sources. Most likely children drank cider. Certainly, sometimes alcoholic as well, but not as much as ale. In fact, this drink is regarded in the sources as weak beer, Old English beor and Old Norse björ, which is cider. And in the sources we have references to a different type of beer, actual beer, which is regarded as strong beer, Old English ilo and Old Norse öl, which is ale, actual beer, and not cider. English translations of the sagas will translate both öl and björ interchangeably as beer or ale, so we have to be careful with that from now on. So, this reinforces the value of ale for these societies, regarded as strong beer, ale as actual beer and not cider. And we know that it was this strong beer, ale, that was consumed in the most important festivals, while cider was much more common, and mead, common still and far older its production, and also used for other specific special occasions of a religious purpose. So when the runic formula ALU appears in these contexts, we have been dealing with in here today in this video, it's really ale, actual beer, strong beer, and not cider, weak beer, and not mead. Alright, my dear friends, I hope you have enjoyed today's video. Thank you so much for watching. See you on the next video. And as always, tack för idag. Thanks for today. Obrigado por hoje. Farewell.